Oh my gods. It's finally done. So I was at the store like 6 months ago and saw this Micro Galaxy Squadron ATTE on sale. So of course I picked it up, knowing I just had to make it into a diorama. Oh, how foolish I was. Little did I know what I was getting myself into. At the time, I was mostly excited to find that the included bark speeder was all warped. It gives me a good excuse to blow it up instead of fix it. But before anything else, we need to plan how to add lights. So let's get it apart. Electrical repair toolkits are great for this. Of course, we'll want to carefully remove any clear parts while we're building so we don't mess them up. And for a base, I found this amazing panel at the thrift store for $1, someone's old painting project, which will give me plenty of room to work with. And of course, the last ingredient, a big chunk of XPS foam. Maybe with this I'll finally make a dent in that one sheet of XPS I bought like 2 years ago. Or maybe not. Starting with a big slab, we can glue it down to the panel with foam-safe superglue. Then we use a hot wire cutter to trim it to the size of the panel. In a ventilated area, go slow. The cutoffs can then be stacked onto the board to build up the terrain and cut back down with the wire cutter. Once we have a general shape we like, we can refine it further with a knife and a blowtorch. Again, while in a ventilated area, to give the surface a more organic look and add in a riverbed. Once the main shape is done, it's time to clean up a bit so we can prep the next stage. Plaster rocks. The molds for these can be found at most hobby stores and can be used to quickly make highly detailed rock shapes that will meet the approval of even the most discerning clone trooper captain. Once they're dry, we can pop them out and even break them up to get a wide variety of rocky outcroppings and cliff faces that will really help to sell the scale in the finished products by adding small points of high detail. A little foam-safe superglue is all it takes to tack them into place around the terrain. Then it's time for the magic goop. Water for thinning, paint for color, just to make it easier to see where you've applied it as it dries, plaster for texture, and Mod Podge to seal the foam and protect it from the spray primer. Start with a thin coat everywhere, then layer on some more plaster-heavy chunks in areas where you want to build up texture and blend gaps or sharp bumps in the surface. This time, I tried adding my cork rocks and sand to the diorama while the plaster was still wet, hoping they would stick in it, but it didn't really seal as well as I would have liked. So after taking the whole thing outside to prime, I ended up sealing them all down with a layer of thinned down white glue and isopropyl alcohol anyway. While that dries, we can plan the lights. I'm thinking at the least we want an illuminated display in the cockpit and on the gunner's seat, and an explosion effect around a freshly fired shell from the main cannon. The display LEDs are easy enough to tack in place with a drop of superglue, and then we can route the wires down through the body and back to one of the legs. An X-Acto knife actually makes for a great router bit when you want to hand drill a channel of variable size but aren't too worried about precision or finish. For the cannon, we'll use some flexible LED filaments for the explosion plume flare thing. Fun fact, the primary cannon on an ATTE is not a blaster cannon, but a mass driver cannon instead. It actually fires a physical round, before you go telling me in the comments that it shouldn't be firing a shell. Unfortunately, the cannon seems to have a metal support rod in it, so running the wire through isn't really an option, though I do have to commend the development team on attention to detail, making sure this fragile part wouldn't snap off. Thankfully, since we opted to have a cliff in the background, we can run the wire along the back of the barrel and blend it in with paint later. It shouldn't be too noticeable. A couple filaments bent into loops make the body of the explosion, and a straight one held in place with some clear-coated copper wire will be enough to support the shell later. Now we can get to painting. First, a white zenithal highlight to start, followed by a wash of browns, and greens along the river and in the shadows for contrast. This is the part where I have to confess, I actually didn't set out to make this diorama set somewhere that didn't look like Geonosis. My brain just defaulted to ATTE means red desert, and it was somewhere about halfway along here that I went, wait, that's lame, and brought in more greens and warm dark tones. Once you've got a good dirt base, grab a makeup brush and a mixture of grays and start dry brushing on the rocks to pick them out. You don't want to totally cover the rocks. Leaving the brown-green undertones peeking through really helps to make them feel more natural and realistic. A light, almost white coat brushed just faintly along the edges finishes them off. Now, it's time for plants. First, a layer of moss along the riverbank and in the crevices around the rocks. Then I opted for some brambles hugging the cliff walls and in various points of interest around the base. Time for a fit check. We'll have the ATTE mid-step as it forges through the stream. At this point, I opted to lock most of the joints in place with thin superglue, so I don't have to attempt to constantly repose it the way I want. After marking the foot placement, it's time for grass, using a static applicator. Grass goes in the barrel, and a small electrical contact placed near the application point helps to give the grass a slight charge to make it stand up. After we're done, a tissue placed over a vacuum can be used to suck up all the extra and save it for later reuse. Now back in the beginning, I said we were going to blow up the speeder. So what's blowing it up? A stap, of course. I don't know why, but I've always found these little things fascinating. A brass tube fed through the base gives a perfect anchor for it. In hindsight, this could have been clearer, but at the time I wasn't sure if I wanted to feed LED wires through it or not. Now let's move on to finishing the ATTE, starting by routing all the wires together and twisting that new lead into a single cable with the Dremel. You can do this by sandwiching the ends of the wire in the jaws of the Dremel, and then running it on low for just a second. After popping a hole in the foot with a drill, we can run the cable through and tack it down to the back of the leg with glue. Now the colors on this are pretty decent, so we'll use the same trick we did in the last Microgalaxy Squadron project and prime the whole thing in a matte clear coat so we can reuse them. And then we can just apply some basic color correction and weathering. The particles in the matte coat give just enough tooth for the paint layers to adhere to cleanly. And since we're not going to be handling this, it should be strong enough. Once the clear coat dries, we'll get started with our color correcting on the panels and legs with a light bluish gray, allowing us to paint over some of the heavier, less accurate wear in the original paint job. Then we'll knock back the grays and shade everywhere in with some clear inks. Next, we'll correct the markings. This original release of the ATTE figure used the Attack of the Clones style markings, but I'd rather have it match the Clone Wars appearance, so those can be painted on by color matching the existing paint on the wet palette, and then using a long brush to carefully add the missing markings. Next, we'll darken up the gunner seat and cockpit interior with dark gray base tones, and use the same paint to scuff marks all around the corners of the armor. We'll then follow those up with silver to give the appearance of bits of paint that have been blasted and scuffed away in battle. You could also do this with chipping fluid to actually physically layer the paint, but that takes a lot more time, and the end result here looks good enough. Then it's on to the finer details: cockpit interior, gun orbs and barrels, and control electronics. And once all that's done, we go back with the airbrush for a final pass with some ink washes to tie it all together, and then black puffs at very extreme angles to give really believable blaster marks as they skid off the armor. Now let's take care of the stab. It came in Trade Federation brown, but if this is a battle with clones, it needs to be CIS blue instead. So as usual, we'll start with zenithal and then a blue airbrush coat. Then we can brush in the missing pieces, including the white CIS markings with a fine brush. And finally, we'll use some Tamiya panel lining for the panels and weathering. Then it's time to drop the pole into place, glue it in, and paint over the pole with some Musso black. Now for the speeder. This one will definitely need lights running through it. So we'll route a few through the support pole and solder them into loops. Then we can build up an explosion with cotton batting, sticking it through the LED loops to support and hold it in place. Once the basic shape has taken place, we can use a felting needle to condense and shape the explosion. This takes time and patience, but gives you lots of control. At the very end, we can gently flick the shape with a torch to tighten it up and burn off any stray wispies. Then we're on to painting with inks. Yellow, then orange, then red, and finally black. And with some judicial application of the clippers, we can turn the speeder into speeder wreckage and glue it directly to the explosion. Then we'll go back over it all with a coat of dark gray everywhere. And we'll remove the excess from the speeder pieces with a Q-tip dipped in isopropyl. I use these tiny Q-tips from Tamiya because they give you a lot more control than the typical hygiene ones you'll find at the grocery store. We'll give the lights a quick test, and then we're good to move on to the star of the show. We'll start by drilling a hole for the wires that are coming out of the foot, and threading that through. Then we can tack all the feet in place with superglue. Anywhere that they don't quite sit flush with the base can be fixed with a technical medium like the Sterling mud from Games Workshop, although it's basically just acrylic paint mixed with model train ballast if you want to make your own. Once it's all in place, we'll repeat the explosion sculpting for the barrel, but this time with the added step of the soldering iron. If applied very gently, you can use the tip to melt fine creases into your explosions and get more detail. Once the painting is done, we can use a Dremel to shape a bit of mass driver around from a bit of polystyrene rod like a lathe. This works great when combined with a hobby knife or a scribing chisel and some sandpaper. Once the shape's done, we can cut it off, glue it in place, paint it up, and we're good to go. For the lasers, we'll mount some filaments on clear-coated copper wire, though we want to make sure to scrape the clear insulation off the ends of the wire first. Then we can drill some holes through the base and slot them in. After marking out the positive and negative leads on the bottom side, we'll tie everything together and solder. Now it's time for cable management. Super glue works wonders for this when combined with glue accelerator. A little drop will handily tack almost everything in place. To finish off the electronics, we'll need a switch, a USB port, and some potentiometers to serve as dimmers. One for each lighting element will let us adjust the voltage going to each piece individually after it's all wired up. After popping in one extra laser beam, the clones in the tank need to avenge their fallen brother after all, we can add a little life to them by brushing on random bits of UV resin. This will diffuse the light just a bit, but it will also give them a rippling, moving appearance, especially in person. Then we'll want to caulk around the foot with silicone, so resin doesn't drip through the power feed, and mix up a bit of dirty-looking resin and cure it in place over the silicone to hide it. Unfortunately, somewhere at this point, something got messed up in the foot cabling, and while the more important part of the explosions wires survived, the power feed to the display light died. So we're unfortunately only left with a single light on the inside. There's not much we can do to go back at this point. Next, we'll use the same silicone to pop acrylic sheets onto all the stream ends, so we can get a crisp edge with our resin pour. But in this case, since the river is flowing downhill, we'll actually use UV resin instead of 2-part resin, and we'll just build it up in thin layers by hand. The key to doing it this way is to go very slow, in gradual layers. If you go too thick, you'll get a layer that cures on top before curing all the way through, which will give you some very weird bubbles and edge lines as the different layers contract and expand as they heat. Once it's cured all the way through, we can pull off the acrylic and break out the Woodland Scenic's water texture. Then it's just a painting game, building it up all over. Long and streaky textures in the straightaways, heavy rolling textures in the drops, and choppy in the shallows. Once it's all in place, hit it with a couple sprays of isopropyl and water. I usually go for 50% isopropyl in cases like this, to soften out the shapes just a little bit. Now let's get the waterfall on. We'll start with a bit of clear plastic clipped out of some packaging. You have been saving all those clear plastic bits from boxes, right? Hold it well over a flame to heat and soften it, not too close, and then bend it into shape. Next, we'll layer on UV resin to give it a rippling look. Keep your textures long and flowing here. Use a bit of wax or parchment paper under your workspace to keep it all from sticking. While we're at it, we'll also draw out some resin splashes and cure those too. Then we'll lock everything into place with more resin. Once that resin is cured, we'll go in with more water effects to add the splashes and coursing water around the rocks. And the resin splashes we drew out before can now be attached at the bottom of the waterfall, and then be given just a little more volume with some extra resin brushed onto their surface. Once water effects is dried, note that it goes on white, but it does dry clear eventually. We'll go back in with some white acrylic paint to add choppy froth and ripples. And then finally, at long last, we'll clean up the base with Musso Black. And with that, it's ready. Look, when I started this project, I didn't really intend for it to take 3 months. It wound up being pretty daunting. Not only did I end up with a whole bunch of unexpected challenges in my personal life that left me with very little time to work on this, but the lights, the scale of the terrain, the sheer number of things to paint all really took me by surprise on this one. But I kept at it, and in the end, I couldn't be happier with it. It'll look great on my shelf. I hope that whatever you're working on, this inspires you to keep at it no matter what challenges you face. Don't be afraid to try something bigger just because it might seem a little daunting. And I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's supported and commented. It's been wild to see it grow. I know we're not even at 100 subscribers yet, but it really means a lot to me, and I appreciate each and every one of you. I originally started this channel to give my hobbies a little more structure and to have a way to share them with the world. I tend to make this stuff just for myself, and it spends a lot of time just sitting on my shelves without anyone to see it. And knowing that there's anyone out there who can find benefit from what I'm doing really means a lot to me. So thank you all, and I hope you get a chance to do something that makes you happy this week. And I'll see you next time here on Witch Cove Crafts. Thanks. Can you go now?